It's such a wonderful mix of art and science, of history and modern technology, of culture, of shared experience. There's some of everything in wine. There's something for everybody. And I think that's why I love it so much.
Absolutely. Do you have a medical mind approach to winemaking? Are there intersections in the way that you approach your new career from your past training?
Having a strong science background is very helpful in the winery because when things go wrong with your wine, 99.9% of the time, it is always going to be biochemistry secondary to microbiology. It's some kind of spoilage organism, a bacteria, a yeast that you don't want around that creates some kind of a byproduct that you don't want in the wine. So if you can see that coming, if you can head off disaster before it happens, it helps a lot.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 194. Would you like to discover some weird but wonderful food pairings for Zinfandel? How can American Viticultural Areas, AVAs, help you find new wines to love? And how does yeast have a profound impact on wine's taste? You'll hear those tips and stories in my chat with Kerith Overstreet, the winemaker at Bruliam Wines in Sonoma, California, and a former medical doctor. She has some fascinating stories to share. Now, on a personal note, before we dive into the show with the continuing story of publishing my new wine memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. I've always had this odd feeling that in my writing, my personality is like an oil painting, whereas in person, I'm more diluted, like watercolors. I think that's because when I write, I can pack a lot into each sentence and then refine it until it's loaded with meaning. But in conversation, my thoughts and words they haven't been worked and reworked. They're kind of all over the place. I think that's why I'm shy when I have a casual meeting or meal with a few people versus being on television, say, where I'm more confident because those segments are completely scripted. That's what makes me nervous about a book tour for this memoir. I'm worried that after people read a book that I've worked on for like 10 years, they might find the person behind the book pale by comparison. So maybe I'll script all my appearances, or maybe I'll try to get out of my head with this circular thinking and just relax. Have you ever felt this way, though? Perhaps it's the difference between your resume, which you can perfect, and your answers during a job interview or some other situation. Let me know. I've posted a link to a blog post called Diary of a Book Launch in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/194. This is where I also share more behind-the-scenes stories about the journey of taking this memoir from idea to publication. If you want a more intimate insider seat beside me on this journey, please let me know you'd like to become a beta reader and get a sneak peek of this manuscript. Email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. Okay, on with the show. All right, and just before I introduce our guest, I want to tell you that one of you in the US is going to win a bottle of her gorgeous wine. And all you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and tell me you want to win. It's as easy as that. All right, back to our guest. Kerith Overstreet is a winemaker at Bruliam Wines in Sonoma, California. When she was small, her father used to say, "You can be whatever you want after medical school." I just love that. So she did. After completing medical school, a residency, and 2 fellowships, she thought winemaking sounded more fun. And I can't wait to ask her about that. So she enrolled in the prestigious UC Davis program to study enology and catapulted into the 2008 harvest. Starting with a single barrel, Kerith has grown Bruliam Wines to 1,200 cases a year, and she lives with her husband and 3 children in Healdsburg, California, in Sonoma County, where she joins us now. Hello, Kerith, and welcome.
Hi, Natalie. Thank you so much for having me here today. I am delighted and honored to have this opportunity and platform to share some stories with your passionate wine audience. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. You just have such an interesting story. So I'm just going to take it right from the top. Now, before you went to medical school, you studied 19th century British literature, which caught my attention. And you have a dog.
Oh, I do have a dog who's having a moment. Hold on.
No, no problem. Is he a winery mascot, by the way?
He is. He's Chewie, the vineyard collie, and we call him Chewie, the marketing collie.
Oh, okay. He's head of marketing, I take it.
Well
Sorry,
done.
that's not
That was
even
right
mine.
on the spot. Very good.
I've heard that before.
I may
Anyway,
use that.
yeah. Well, you never know. Everybody needs to work hard on a family-owned winery, so
That's right.
Chewie needs to step up. Okay, so back to 19th century British literature. I ask you this because, well, I'm going to get you to tell me first. Who are your favorite authors, and were the Romantic poets among them? I'm just super curious.
I'm like an Austen Bronte girl. I
Oh,
love Jane Austen. I love the Bronte sisters. I enjoyed George Eliot. I loved Mill on the Floss. I like Christina Rossetti as a poet. I like Elizabeth Barrett Browning as a poet. You can tell I lean towards female authors, and that continues, I think, even to this day as a reader. But who doesn't love Jane Austen? She's
I know.
hilarious.
She's great. And the number of remakes of her books, from Pride and Prejudice to Sense and Sensibility and all the spin-offs. Now we have Bridgerton. I mean, she's spawned a whole category. She's fantastic. And I was curious because I studied the Romantic poets at Oxford and I was focused on Keats. And although there were others who were more popular at the time, but I just love that period in literature. It's just fantastic. But you studied literature. You had to go to medical school, according to your father. Why didn't you take an undergrad in science?
Well, because I knew that I was going to learn everything that I needed for patient care in medical school, right? So even if you take biology as an undergraduate and microbiology as an undergraduate, which I did, I took all of the required courses to go to medical school. I knew that this was sort of being in college was my opportunity to study and enjoy all the courses that I loved and that I was passionate about. And not that I didn't love medicine and science, I did. It just seemed like, why repeat yourself, right? Because even in medical school, you learn the same thing again and again and again and again until it, becomes sort of fact and muscle memory in your brain. So I really used my opportunity as an undergraduate to sort of fulfill all those humanities nerd niches, a lot like yours, right? Like, I was looking back in my library just for you this morning. And yes, I have books on Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley and all of the Romantic poets who are close to your heart too.
Huh. Well, quite the Renaissance woman. I know if I wouldn't, in the first place, dream of medical school, but if I were going, I'd be terrified and want to take all sciences to make sure I passed. But you obviously are very strong academically in the sciences. So then you chose the University of Rochester for medical school. Now, why did you decide on that university in particular?
That's a great question. So that was actually my absolute first choice for medical school. And it's for two reasons. Number one, they tend to have a very artsy medical school class. They want to cultivate a cohort of physicians who are multidisciplinary, who are caring, who are broad and deep in their perspectives. And they tend to have at least 50% of the incoming medical school class students who studied things other than a science major as an undergraduate. So when I started there, we had a woman who was an art history major from Williams College. We had a giant cohort of kids from Johns Hopkins, all of whom were writing seminars majors. We had someone who was psychology at Yale. He went on to become a psychiatrist. We had someone who'd been an opera singer, and then she decided to go to medical school. I mean, what an interesting class of diverse and divergent thinking students, really bringing all of that experience to the table and to patient care. And the other reason I picked Rochester is they invented the biopsychosocial model of medicine, which now it seems really everybody knows, whether or not you're a physician, that your mood affects your health, right? But there was a time when this connection between mind and body was sort of new science, right? There was a time when people thought it was juju, but we now recognize that so many aspects of our health are intertwined and that our mental health and our physical health are inextricably bound together in terms of
Wow.
wellness.
Very holistic and also very Renaissance again in terms of perspective for medical school. That's terrific. And is that where you first discovered wine? I mean, Rochester, New York would have been close to Finger Lakes. So is that where you got into wine, or had you been sort of attracted to wine drinking at least before you went to medical school?
And I had some wine in college. And then in medical school, the big revelation was 10% discount when you buy a case. So being medical students, we would all pool together until we had enough people to buy a case of wine so that we got the 10% discount. So yes, I started enjoying wine in medical school and continued to enjoy it through my residency and fellowships in pathology, where I really developed a passion for wine.
Fascinating. So you completed years and years of training to become a pathologist, which, side note, for those like me who didn't know what that really meant, a doctor's doctor because you're specialists and you help a patient's physician to confirm a diagnosis. I just had to confirm, though, is that like Dr. House on the television series? Is he a pathologist?
Okay, so I'm super embarrassed that I've never watched the show, but I do
Oh,
know
it's
who the
okay.
actor
You
is.
were busy.
But like I'm the person who, if someone gets a biopsy, let's like take the most basic thing, a skin biopsy. Okay, I have this freckle. This freckle looks weird. So your physician takes off the freckle and it gets sent to the lab. I'm the person who looks under the microscope at the freckle and says, "Oh, this is an okay freckle," or "Oh, this is bad. This looks like it could be melanoma." That's just sort of the most basic understanding. We do that for the whole body.
Okay. That sounds like Dr. House. So now you've got this whole career set up. You've made your father presumably very happy. So what was the exact moment you realized you actually wanted to become a winemaker? When and where did that switch happen for you?
I think that the first switch happened during my internship in general surgery when I realized I did not want to be a surgeon. And then from there, I switched into surgical pathology. And I guess, it never dawned on me that I could be a winemaker, that it is actually sort of a career that one could pick. And I had the opportunity to make wine on a very small scale my first year, 1 barrel of wine. And I sort of leaped into it. And I do what medical students do best. The night before I knew the fruit was coming in, I read a textbook. And so I showed up and I was able to parrot back chunks of winemaking material with literally no context, right? I was just like a talking head. And because people thought I knew a lot more than I did at the crush pad, to be fair, I literally knew nothing, right? Except I'm just parroting this stuff back. They let me do more. And from there, that first day on the crush pad, I was like, wow, this is for me. I just kept asking questions. How do you know what to do? Why are you doing this? Why don't you do it this way? Why do you do it that way? And I just fell in love with it. It's such a wonderful mix of art and science, of history and modern technology, of culture, of shared experience. There's some of everything in wine. There's something for everybody. And I think that's why I love it so much. It's a lifelong education journey to which you can attest.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I didn't grow up thinking I'd be a wine writer, but here we are, right? Life takes different turns as we go along. So do you think that you apply? I mean, you already alluded to it. You read a textbook the night before, but do you have a medical mind approach to winemaking? Are there intersections in the way that you approach your new career from your past training?
Yeah, there are for sure. So I don't think, you don't have to go to medical school to be a winemaker, right? But having a strong science background is very helpful in the winery because when things go off the rails, when things go wrong with your wine, it is always 99.9% of the time, it is always going to be biochemistry secondary to microbiology. So, in other words, it's some kind of spoilage organism, a bad actor, a bacteria, a yeast that you don't want around that finds something in the wine that it can eat. And then it eats and consumes that and creates some kind of a byproduct that you don't want in the wine. So if you can see that coming, if you can head off disaster before it happens, it helps a lot. And then, of course, I love fermentation chemistry. I love oxidation reduction chemistry. I love wine science. I think it's really interesting and really fun because it incorporates, you could look under the microscope and look to see what kind of bacteria you have, right? You have all of fermentation science and fermentation chemistry, which is enzymes and kinetics. You have wine aging, which is organic chemistry when it comes down to it, even though no one likes to talk about it. But think about what tannins look like. It's like a whole bunch of chicken wire, right? That's organic chemistry.
Is that what they look like? I've never seen them in a microscope. Chicken wire for
No.
tannins.
Like, I just mean if you were drawing out the chemical structure, it looks like Battlestar Galactica. It's a whole bunch of hashtags. It looks like chicken wire, right? So it's all of these aspects of science that come together to create something that is so subjective, and that really is art with like a lowercase a, right? Because it's subjective and speaks to our emotions and speaks to place and time and a shared experience.
Very artfully put. That's lovely. You've, I believe, described yourself as type A. So what was the hardest thing about adjusting to winemaking? What did you find a challenge?
There are things beyond your control, which is something that I'm not used to relinquishing control. So it can become something as mundane as being frustrated with UPS, right? Like, I can control everything from the minute I pick the grapes to the temperature that I ferment them to how much pressure I use when I press them, to what kind of barrels I use, to what's the dissolved oxygen before it goes onto the bottling line. And it's stored in a warehouse, and it's temperature controlled. And then it goes out in a UPS truck to someone's house, and darn it, wouldn't you believe I get these frustrated, angry phone call. The wine's been delivered somewhere else. The wine's been delayed. The wine's been lost. Like, it's just annoying. But, of course, the bigger picture, of course, is Mother Nature, which we really can't control. So when we're dealing with winemaking, which really is dealing with agriculture and farming, you really need to take a deep breath and sort of learn to roll with the punches. And it takes time. Like, I joke that probably one of my finest moments was the first year I was making Chardonnay. And I make Chardonnay from a very cool climate site in the Sonoma coast called the Heinz Vineyard. It's owned by Charlie Heinz. And I remember calling him, very well-known vineyard. I remember calling him saying, "Hey, Charlie, it's raining." And he's like, "Yep, it's raining." So Charlie's an old school farmer, right? Nothing phases him. He's unflappable. I'm like, "But Charlie, it's raining." He's like, "Yep." I'm like, "Charlie, should we harvest?" He's like, "Do the grapes taste ripe to you?" I'm like, "Nope." He's like, "Then why would you harvest?" I mean, it's nice to have some institutional memory and a calm voice of reason to talk you off the cliff as you ratchet up your emotions as harvest approaches.
I so relate in other ways, but the whole trying to control everything and type A and anxiety. So you have another friend who helped you through this. You're both runners. Tell us about her and how she helped you in the early days, especially.
Yeah, so I feel very lucky to have a cohort of wonderful colleagues, male and female, but mostly female winemakers, whom I trust and can talk to when I feel like things are about to go sideways. And Karen Meyer from Meyer Family Cellars is one of my best friends, and she's been my longtime running partner. We run every Saturday morning. We used to run at 5 a.m. Now we run at 6 a.m. When we were younger, we did,
Clackers.
I think, like 12 miles. Now we do 9 because our knees are a little bit crankier. But it's just really nice to sort of pound the pavement and work through all your frustrations, both sort of physically and mentally. So we can be pounding and I'll be breathing hard and say, "What do you think about this wine? I think the VA is going up. What do you think I should do?" And, she has been a winemaker all over the world. She trained in Australia. She's worked in New Zealand. She's worked in France. She's worked in Oregon before she settled here. And she has a global perspective. And again, it's just really helpful to hear her perspective and to know that I can just really trust her when I have questions or problems that are confusing. Like, especially the first year I was making Chardonnay. She's been making Chardonnay for like 15 years. So she's the woman I turn to. I have like this eidetic memory. So I remember all these different facts. So I get texts from her like, can you remember what the dose is on Claristar? I need to cold stabilize the rosé. And I'm like, oh, it's da 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 da. And I can just text her right back.
Oh, that's
So it's
convenient.
a pretty good yin yang balance for friendship.
That is terrific. And have you ever experimented with yeasts or had any frustration with them?
Oh, all the time. I love that stuff. So I love talking about yeast. Everybody else's eyes pretty much glaze over.
Yeah.
But, we could spend 2 hours talking about like native yeast versus
Okay, no.
inoculating, but let's not totally do that. But yes,
That'd be
like
a real
I've had.
strain. Anyway, sorry. I can't help myself.
Well, we got to talk about it. It's a must. Banach.
Ah, I love it. Oh my gosh.
Right?
Okay.
So like I had to get one in there.
Yes. Yes. Very good.
So I love talking about yeast strains. And yes, I've had problems where I've had fermentations that have stuck and I've had to deal with that. I've allowed fermentations to go completely native, and we'll use that loosely in quotes. And it is so anxiety provoking for me that given my personality, which is clearly akin to yours, like a high functioning, get stuff done kind of personality, I now know that I'm a lot happier and calmer if I just inoculate the tank. So I let things start native and then I inoculate. And I do very much like to play.
And what does inoculate mean? Just for those who might not know.
Oh, sure. That's a great question. Yeah. So obviously, everybody who's listening knows that we put grapes into a tank and yeast eat the sugar and they convert that sugar to alcohol. That's the process of fermentation. And there's yeast flying around in the air all the time, especially in wineries. And we can use that yeast that is in the air to convert the grape juice into wine. On the other hand, you can buy yeast at a yeast store. We have special winery yeast stores. Just as bakers have yeast stores, and just as you'd go to the grocery store and buy a little packet of Fleischmann's yeast if you were making bread. It's exactly the same thing. So if we're going to inoculate the tank, we would buy the yeast, mix it up according to the instructions. And I'm super old school, so I get a plastic bucket and I pour it over the top of the tank. So that's what I mean by inoculate.
And it stops the fermentation?
It begins the fermentation.
Oh, it begins.
Initiates the
Inoculate. Okay.
fermentations.
Okay, gotcha.
So what's interesting is that grapes come in from the vineyard with lots of different kinds of yeast and bacteria who live on them. And some of those yeast and bacteria can certainly eat grape juice and convert it into wine, but very few of them are advanced enough to live through the rising tide of alcohol and make it out the other side alive, which is why Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is the same yeast we use for bread, the same yeast that they use to make beer, is the only yeast and the preferred yeast that will get wine from sugar completely to wine and having consumed all that sugar. They're really a one-trick pony. Those yeasts do one thing only. They eat 6-carbon sugar, glucose, and fructose, and they make ethanol, which is wine. One thing. And they're pretty temperature tolerant and they're pretty alcohol tolerant, right? So there are Zinfandels out there that are probably 16% alcohol. And there are yeast in the world that can survive that tide of alcohol.
Wow. Like an Arnold Schwarzenegger yeast or something
Right.
Really strong. Turbo
They're
yeast.
super duper yeast.
Yes.
They work out.
That's a very clear explanation. I like getting into little areas like that, not too deep down the rabbit hole, but to help us understand kind of some of the fundamentals of what's happening there. So, do you like to do experiments too, given your medical training? Like, are you doing any sort of vineyard or in the winery type of experiments with your winemaking lately?
All the time, from small things to big things, right? So when I make my rosé, I do color trials, which is an experiment where I take the rosé that I have, and if the color seems a little bit pale, I might take some finished Pinot Noir from a neutral barrel and add 1% Pinot Noir, 2% Pinot Noir, 3% Pinot Noir, and see what that does to the color. And it's as simple as taking a graduated cylinder and you could fill it up with 99 mLs of rosé and 1 ml of Pinot Noir, and that's a 1% addition. And you can see what that 1 ml does to the color. And then you can do the same thing at 2% or at 3%. And that's the example of a little tiny experiment. Most recently, I was really excited that I got to be part of a bigger, broader enology project that is looking at specific enzymes that can cleave the bond in sugars to allow certain compounds to volatilize so that we could remove them. So this is an experiment that's looking at enzymes that could be a remediator for wines that have smoke impact. So my wines did not have smoke impact. So this is the early stages of the experiment where they're just looking at the enzyme and the safety of the enzyme, and does this enzyme indeed cleave the sugar bond we're looking at. So it was super duper cool. Yeah. So it's really, really cool. So it's, we added the enzyme to some bottles of my wine, and then we didn't add it to other bottles of wine, which were the control. And then all that wine got sent to the TTB, to the government, as part of an experiment. So I feel lucky that I get to participate in experiments big and small all the time.
TTB is the Tobacco Bureau. Is
Oh,
it
yeah.
firearms, all kinds of
Exactly.
stuff?
Yeah, it used to be
Okay.
BAFTA, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And now it's the TTB. But
Okay.
yes, they're sort of the head honchos in the federal government who oversee alcohol.
Gotcha. All right. So back to your wine label, which is interesting and sounds scientific. Brulium, is that how you pronounce it?
It
Brulium?
is well done. Yes,
Okay. Okay.
exactly. Bruliam.
Tell us how you came up with that name.
Thanks for asking. So Bruliam is named after my three kids. The Bru is Bruno, the Lee is Lily, and the Am is Amelia. And Brulium sounds like cadmium or polonium. So our logo and branding has always been a riff on the periodic table of elements. And our tagline has been wine is elemental, right? Like
Great.
elemental to
I
a
like
life
it.
well lived, elemental to gathering your friends, spending time with family, sort of fellowship, shared community fellowship in those wonderful experiences of food and wine and time and love together.
Oh, that's
But
lovely.
a cheeky nod to, of course, the fact that I went to medical school
Yeah,
and I have a science background.
I love that. So you, if I understand correctly, met your husband when you were in grade 10. What does he do at the winery? Have you been together all that time? And what does he do there?
So, as I mentioned to you, he's Canadian. He is from Toronto. He
Yes.
moved to San Diego when we were in 10th grade. And we've been basically, for all essential purposes, together ever since, other than some short on off during college and beyond. And the jokes about my husband, Brian, are number one, if you see him at a wine event or at the winery, it's like sighting a unicorn. He's always behind the scenes. He does not want to be on camera. I think in all of Instagram, he features in maybe 2 pictures. We post a lot of stuff. So maybe once a year, he'll show up at a wine event and pour some wine. But for the most part, he's behind the scenes. He's sort of the guy who loads all the wines onto the web page to make sure that it's functional when we do a release and that people can buy wine and click it and put it in their cart. The other thing he's famous for is for being the CF no. As in, Brian, I think we should make port. No.
No.
Brian, I have this awesome idea. Let's make a Marsanne Roussanne blend. And he's like, if you really want to lose money, then that's a good idea. So I call him the CF no. Like, hey, there's this extra fruit at the end of harvest. I can just get this extra 3 tons. No.
Well, he sounds like he has some guardrails around your creativity, but you work well together.
Yes, exactly. Keeps us from financial ruin.
Is that the "how do you know my husband" story? Is that because he's so shy? Is that,
No. Okay, so the how do you know my husband story is the how I have Zinfandel fruit story.
Ah,
So that story is the fact that I had wanted to make rock pile Zinfandel.
what is Rockpile, sorry? Is that a region?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So Rockpile is a region. It's an AVA, which is American Viticultural Area, which is how we designate pieces of territory here in the United States. And it's analogous to a DO or a DOCG or an AOC in European countries in the old world. So it's mandated at the federal level by the TTB. And what an AVA, American Viticultural Area, does is it lets consumers know that wines produced from within this piece of territory share certain characteristics. And that could be the weather, it could be the impact of the wind, it could be the elevation, it could be the amount of rain that it gets, it could be the soil and sunshine and the amount of degree days and heat, which dictate what gets planted in that area. So that when a consumer goes to the grocery store and sees Russian River Valley or Petaluma Gap or Rock Pile on a label, they sort of know what to expect. So Rockpile is a small AVA within Sonoma County that sits at significant elevation. There's no wineries up there. There's no hospitality. It's only grape growing. And I happened upon Rockpile when I was running through the Dry Creek Valley, and I happened upon this winery, and I went in, not when I was running, but at a later time, and tasted the Rockpile Zin and fell in love with it. So I thought, well, I live in Sonoma County. I'm a Pinot girl, but I live in Healdsburg. I run in Dry Creek Valley. That's all about Zin. I should make some Zinfandel. So I started looking on the websites, trying to find out who the growers were. It's all like opaque. It's not very transparent. You can't figure out what's going on. So I tried to send some emails. No one gets back to me. And at that point, I decide it's time for guerrilla warfare. I'm just going to take this into my own hands and get it done. So I go to the farmer's market and I find these beautiful peaches from Dry Creek Peaches. And I make this beautiful galette. And I decide I'm going to bring it to Moritzen Winery on a Saturday and ask about buying fruit. Because Moritzen is the name that's synonymous with crafting delicious Rockpile Zin and growing Rockpile Zin. They're quite a large family and everybody's involved with different aspects of winemaking and viticulture. So I pack up my galette and I put on my lip gloss and I drive to the winery on a Saturday. And just like any popular tourist destination, it's very busy on a Saturday in the summer. And the tasting room attendants are 3 guests deep, trying to pour over their heads and make everyone feel comfortable and welcome. And I waltz in with my pie and say, may I please speak to Clay Moritzen? And they look at me and they're like, Clay, he's not here. He's out of town. I'm like, oh, and they said, but his wife's upstairs. Shall we get her? And so they call up to her, waiting in the corner with my little pie, my galette, and down waddles, and I say waddles, this incredibly beautiful, incredibly petite, and 10 months pregnant woman. Like, how when very teeny, very petite, very slim women, even 3 months pregnant, they look like they're going to fall over. So now we're talking about the fact that it's July, it's hot, it's sweaty, it's full of people in the tasting room, and she is coming down these very precipitous steps from an office that sits above the tasting room. And down she comes down these steps, and she looks at me smiling, holding a pie, and she looks me up and down, and she goes, how do you know my husband?
Oh,
And I just wanted to cry. Luckily, we're all friends now. It's all good. My kids took swim lessons at their house. Their family is wonderful, warm, and gracious. And I continue to this day to buy Zinfandel grapes from her brother-in-law. But we did have a rocky initial moment.
wow.
That's the old how do you know my husband story.
That's great. That's great. I love that. So yeah, you said you're a Pinot girl, and we'll get to Pinot in more depth because you really have a great focus on that. But since we're talking Zin, that's how you got into Zin. But you have a couple of really wonderful but slightly weird pairings for Zinfandel. Tell us about those.
Well, I guess my favorite has to be chocolate almond biscotti with Zinfandel. So it is a recipe. People ask me for it all the time. You can find it on cookinglight.com under the recipe Tuscan almond biscotti. They're super easy to make, but when I make them, you got to amp it up. You got to zhuzh it up. So for me, the Rockpile Zin often has mocha notes and all of these wonderful secondary aromatics that come from the barrels. So you're going to get lots of baking spice, cardamom, warm, all the warm baking spices that you think about when you're making banana bread or apple pie. So when I make my chocolate almond biscotti, I start with chocolate almonds as opposed to regular almonds. So we're no longer in like cooking light territory. We're just in delicious territory. So you got to do chocolate almonds. And I like to use dark chocolate because that has a more depth of chocolate flavor. And then I like to add a whole bunch of aromatic spices. So I add cardamom, Asian 5-spice, some ginger for warmth. And, they're nice and they're like crispy and they're not soft and they're really awesome dunked in the Zinfandel. So I'll go out into the market and talk to wine buyers at restaurants and I'll bring them a little bag of biscotti and I'm like, dunk it in, just do it. They're like really embarrassed. And then I peer pressure them. Everybody's doing it. Everybody dunks it. And then they take their cookie and they dunk it into the Zinfandel and they have a bite and they're like, oh my God, this is delicious.
Oh, wow.
Because my Zinfandel is not sweet. There's no residual sugar, but it's got, lots of fruitiness and having that like crunchy cookie dunked into the wine, and the aromatics from the wine mirror the aromatics in the cookie. And you get like the mocha notes just sort of like explode in your mouth. It's so delicious. And I absolutely wish I could take credit for this tradition, but it is fully Italian. I have jumped on the bandwagon.
And is that why you call it Zin Santo?
Exactly. Because as you know, Vin Santo is an Italian tradition with little biscotti that are almond. They do not have chocolates, they do not have spices, and they're very small, dunked in a sweet wine called Vin Santo. So that's my like Natalie pun. That
Here,
instead of
I love
Vin
it.
Santo, it's Zinfandel,
Instant.
so it's Zin Santo.
Oh, that's terrific. Do you have the recipe for your biscotti on your website?
I don't know, but I can send it and then you could
Oh, sure.
totally share it. I don't think it's actually on the website.
Okay.
You can definitely share with your readers. I'm a big recipe sharer. Nobody invented a recipe unless you're Escoffier.
Yeah, exactly. And we can put it in the show notes, and we'll still be linking to your website in the show notes. So one way or the other, listeners can get that recipe. So it just sounded amazing when you were describing it. I want to try it.
And biscotti are easy and they pack and travel well because the harder they are, the better they get.
Oh, good. Oh, nice to know. Yeah, I'm always drying out bread and food, and so that's right up my alley. But you have another pairing for Zinfandel. Tell us about that one.
Okay, so I have heard that Cool Ranch Doritos and Zinfandel is sublime. So I haven't totally tried this one yet. I've been a little bit nervous. I'm not a big Cool Ranch Dorito eater. So maybe I'll have to try this and like post it on social media. So I'm down for unusual pairings. Like I really like rosé with chicken noodle soup. I think it's a great pairing, but I am definitely going to have to explore the Cool Ranch Dorito one.
Yeah, the Cool Ranch Dorito. I haven't tried that either. I don't even eat Cool Ranch Doritos, not because I don't like them, but I just haven't tried them. They're not in my universe yet. So, yeah, we'll have to report back to listeners after more experiments.
Exactly. It can be a winery experiment.
Exactly. So, in your winemaking career, is there a moment that stands out as a career highlight?
I was thinking about that one and I can't think of any single career highlight, although I'm constantly renewed and delighted when people who drink my wine send me emails and pictures. And I feel so lucky that my wine gets to be part of dinners and celebrations. So nothing brings me more joy when someone sends me an email or sends a text and it's a picture of someone holding a bottle of my wine standing at the top of a waterfall. And they're like, we went on this hike and the only thing that we schlepped up were sandwiches and a bottle of your rosé. Or someone says, we were celebrating our 10th wedding anniversary and we met you at the winery 5 years ago. And today we're bringing out the 2015 Gaps Crown Pinot to have with this special dinner we're having at home. And, just feeling connected to people is the reason I do what I do. So rather than thinking of a career highlight as any one thing, I feel lucky that I have all of these moments that happen frequently that continue to rejuvenate me and keep me excited to do what I do and keep experimenting and keep playing.
I love that. And again, I resonate so much with that, Kerith, because my favorite career moments in writing are not awards and such. It's when people email me and, I've had emails from, there was a young man who was stationed in a submarine for months and he was reading it to pass the time. And then you get emails from somebody else who's reading it in another place and picking out different lines and things. It is that human connection and just imagining where they are and that you've had this moment with them, at least not virtually, but through your work, through your creativity.
Absolutely. It's the shared human experience. And when you write your stories and moments of the highest high and moments of the lowest low and everything in between and the grit and determination to keep going forward, to keep moving, those are the moments that resonate with people's hearts. That's the shared human experience that makes it special. Like no one cares if I got a 94. Honestly, no one cares if I use 30% new oak and it comes from Francois Frere. People want to know that I picked up the hose during harvest and I focused it the wrong way, turned it on, and I splashed myself in the crotch. And all day the interns made fun of me. Like, that's what people want to know.
I love that.
Right? Or that, like, you bent over to clean out a bin and you split your pants. Like, that's the stuff people want to know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that's the stuff they can relate to, like the humor, the humility, the fact that looks very glamorous on the outside, traveling around the world, tasting wines around the globe and writing about them seems like the most glamorous dream job in the world, Natalie. But beneath that, there's this very human woman who shares the same experiences that we do, right? Like raising a kid, doing dishes, vacuuming your house. We all do those same things together.
It's true. It's true. Yeah, it's not all Skittles and Zinfandel at 9 a.m. in the morning when you're looking at this lineup and the people go, tiny violins, tiny. But it's like, okay, fine. I'll not complain. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Kerith. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, I love Kerith's pairing suggestions for Zinfandel. Those are on my list to try this week. 2, she shares a great overview of how American Viticultural Areas, AVAs, can help us find particular styles of wine we love, or at least know what to expect. And 3, Kerith even manages to make yeast interesting as she shares with us how profound its impact can be on wine's taste. In the show notes, you'll find my email contact, the full transcript of my conversation with Kerith, links to her wines and website, and where you can find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live every Wednesday at 7 p.m. You'll also find a link to my free Ultimate Guide to Wine and Food Pairing. That's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/194. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or would like to become a beta reader of my new memoir at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Kerith. In the meantime, if you missed episode 104, go back and take a listen. I chat about Zinfandel with California winemaker Joel Peterson. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
Baby back ribs are a wonderful match, and there are several wines that go really well with baby back ribs, in part because Zinfandel has this really pretty sweet fruit. The blend he may be talking about is Besieged, which is a traditional California field blend based on what California did pre-Prohibition. Nobody was trying to make varietal wines. They were trying to make wines that tasted good and were particular for that location. They planted grapes together called Zinfandel, of course, Petit Syrah, Carignan, Alicante, Bochet, sometimes a little Grenache, sometimes a little Syrah, sometimes a little Matara or Mourvèdre. But those were the blending grapes of California. And so Besieged is based on that concept.
If you like this episode, please email or tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the wines and stories we discussed. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week, perhaps a Zinfandel with some spicy Dorito chips. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.